Louisiana is known for its rich culture and haunting beauty. But beneath the surface lies a deeper story, one of ancient civilizations, forgotten tribes, and unexplained structures, from mysterious mounds to vanished villages. These lesser-known mysteries challenge what we think we know about the region's past and hint at secrets still buried in the bayou. Poverty Point Earthworks. If you ever find yourself standing on the wide ridges of Poverty Point, you'll know pretty quickly you're not on just any stretch of land. You're standing on something ancient and honestly a little baffling. This place isn't just a bunch of old dirt mounds. It's something far more intentional, massive, complex, and built over 3,000 years ago, long before the Roman Empire, long before the pyramids of Giza were even finished. Located in northeastern Louisiana near the quiet little town of EPS, Poverty Point covers nearly 900 acres. It's made up of large mounds, sweeping concentric ridges, and big open plazas. You wouldn't expect this out here in the middle of what looks like ordinary farmland. And yet, it's one of the most puzzling archaeological sites in North America. Now, here's the strange part. The people who built this weren't farmers. They weren't living in cities or growing crops in tidy rows. According to everything we know about this period, they were hunter-gatherers. They moved from place to place, hunting animals and gathering wild food. And still, they somehow managed to pull off an engineering project that would challenge even modern construction crews. No machines, no metal tools, no wheels, just baskets and people. Start with the design. The ridges at Poverty Point are arranged in 6 giant C-shaped arcs, kind of like ripples spreading out on a pond. Inside that pattern is a huge central plaza about 40 acres in size. And standing off to the side is the most jaw-dropping part. Mound. It's often called the bird mound because of its shape. Some say it looks like a bird in flight. This mound alone contains over 238,000 cub-m of earth. All of it moved by hand, one basket at a time. And the craziest thing, archaeologists think it might have been built in just a few months. Not years. Months. This doesn't match the usual story we tell about early cultures. How could people who didn't have permanent homes organize something this massive? How do you get hundreds, maybe thousands of people to work together without a central government or written language or any real technology? That's one of the big questions researchers still don't have an answer for. What kind of social system could pull this off? Was there a chief giving orders? Or was it more like a shared belief that motivated people to work together? Maybe it was spiritual. Maybe it was something else entirely. We just don't know. And then there's the question of why here. This spot isn't near any major river system. It doesn't sit on especially fertile land. It's quiet, rural, and kind of out of the way. So, why choose this location? Many archaeologists believe the placement wasn't random. Some parts of the site seem to line up with the sun's position during solstices. That suggests the builders were watching the sky. They were keeping track of time, of seasons, maybe even building a kind of giant calendar in the earth. But it gets even weirder when you look at what they left behind. Thousands of artifacts have been uncovered at Poverty Point. Stone tools, beads, clay figurines, and strange objects called cooking balls, which were probably used to heat up food. But what's most surprising is where the materials came from. The raw stones used in these tools weren't local. Some came from the Appalachian Mountains, some from Missouri, others from the Gulf Coast or as far as Arkansas. Think about what that means. A group of people supposedly nomadic and without agriculture was somehow involved in a massive trade network stretching across what's now the eastern half of the U.S. That's not just impressive. It's mind-blowing. These weren't isolated bands of people. They were connected. They had knowledge of geography, trade routes, and relationships with distant groups. That changes the picture completely. Poverty Point wasn't just a temporary camp. It may have been a gathering place, a spiritual center, a hub of trade, ceremony, or even leadership for a much larger region. This might have been the place people came to exchange goods, share stories, conduct rituals, or maybe even learn. But despite everything we've uncovered, we're still left with more questions than answers. How long was it used? Most evidence points to activity between 1700 and 1100 B.C. But then at some point it was abandoned and we don't know why. There are no signs of war, no fire, no destruction, just a slow fade into silence. One theory is climate change. Maybe the environment shifted and large gatherings became harder to support. Another theory is cultural change. Maybe newer generations simply moved on, carrying different beliefs, different priorities. Today, Poverty Point is a protected historic site. It's peaceful, sometimes eerily so. If you visit on a quiet morning, when the fog rolls low across the mounds, you'll probably be one of only a few people there. The silence is almost heavy. You can walk the ridges, climb Mound Day, and look out across the same land that thousands once stood on, celebrating, trading, or maybe praying. Some locals talk about it with a quiet pride. It's not flashy, not crowded, and not always well known outside Louisiana. But it's special. It tells a different story about ancient America. One where complexity, creativity, and community existed without the things we normally think are necessary for civilization. And that's the real heart of the mystery. Poverty Point doesn't fit the mold. It wasn't built by farmers or by people living in cities. It was built by people who lived off the land, who hunted, who gathered, and who somehow built one of the largest and most mysterious complexes in ancient North America. There's no writing, no monuments with names, no temples or tombs. Just earth moved with unbelievable effort aligned with the stars surrounded by objects from hundreds of miles away. It forces us to rethink what we think we know, to ask whether civilization has to follow a specific path or whether there are other ways humans have chosen to come together. Build and believe. Whoever these people were, they left behind more than just mounds. They left behind a message, one we still don't fully understand, one that echoes in the silence of the ridges and the shadow of the bird mound. A message about connection, about purpose, and maybe about something sacred. Poverty Point is more than a mystery. It's a challenge. A reminder that history is full of stories we've barely begun to uncover, and that sometimes the most incredible chapters are written in dirt, not stone. The lost tribe of the Ouachita Mountains, tucked deep in the misty highlands of western Louisiana, brushing right up against the Arkansas border, lies the Ouachita Mountain region. It's peaceful, rugged, beautiful in that quiet, undisturbed kind of way. But beneath the calm, this land holds a whisper, an old story that refuses to fade, a mystery passed down through generations. Some call it folklore. Others believe it's something more. It's the legend of a people who might have lived here long before any European ever set foot on American soil. A mysterious group known as the Lost Tribe of the Ujatas. Now, the idea of a lost tribe might sound like something straight out of a campfire tale. But this story shows up in unexpected places, from old explorer journals to tribal oral traditions. The descriptions are strange and specific. A group with light skin, red or blonde hair, odd customs, and a tendency to keep to themselves. They didn't blend in. They didn't fight with the local tribes. They were just different. One reason this story has stuck around for so long is the region itself. The Ouitas were never heavily developed. There weren't massive cities or busy trade routes cutting through. That isolation gave local legends space to breathe and time to take root. When French explorers came through the area in the 1700s, some of the native tribes they spoke with mentioned a curious people deep in the mountains. Not enemies, not relatives, just strangers, outsiders who lived in caves, built stone structures, and didn't seem to fit the mold. That's where things get interesting. Over the years, settlers, hunters, and explorers started running into strange things out in those hills. Stone-lined tombs, unusual rock formations, skeletal remains that didn't match the known burial practices of the area. Some said the bones were taller than average. Some claimed the skulls looked off somehow elongated maybe. But here's the problem. None of it was officially studied. Most of it wasn't documented. Bones were taken. Artifacts went missing. And as time passed, those early finds turned into half-memories and second-hand stories. Even so, a pattern began to form. Too many odd reports to brush off completely. They weren't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just a hiker stumbling across a low stone wall in the woods. Too well placed to be natural. Other times it was a local mentioning carvings in a cave that no one could explain, and all of it fed the legend. The idea that someone had been there. Someone outside the known history books. Some folks tried to tie it into bigger theories. The most well-known is probably the tale of Prince Madoc, a Welsh explorer who supposedly sailed to North America in the 12th century, centuries before Columbus, and vanished inland. A few theorists suggest his group might have ended up in the Wittas, blending with or becoming something entirely new. Others have tossed out even wilder possibilities. Norse explorers, Phoenicians, even remnants of the mysterious sea peoples from the ancient Mediterranean. But those are at best long shots. There's no real evidence linking the Oitas to ancient Europe. No shipwrecks. No confirmed inscriptions. Just vague similarities and wishful thinking. Still, the pull of the unknown is strong. People want to believe there's also a more grounded theory. One that doesn't require far-off explorers. Maybe this so-called lost tribe was just an isolated indigenous group. One that didn't leave behind much and didn't fit neatly into what we know about the Caddo Choctaw or other tribes in the region. The Southeast was home to hundreds of smaller groups with unique languages, beliefs, and customs. Disease, colonization, and war wiped many of them out before their stories could be recorded. It's entirely possible that one of those cultures survived a little longer in the remote folds of the Oitas. Long enough to be remembered. Just vaguely enough to become a legend. But that still doesn't explain the weirdest part. The structures. Some of the earliest reports described low stone terraces built along the slopes of the mountains. These weren't random rock piles. They looked intentional. Like someone had once shaped the hills into something useful. Maybe for farming. Maybe for shelter. Whatever the purpose. It didn't match what we know about local indigenous architecture. The Southeast wasn't known for stone building. Wood. Yes. Earth. Definitely. But stone. That was rare. Still, people continue to search. Every few years, a hiker or amateur researcher stumbles on something odd. A rock alignment that seems too straight. Or a cluster of mounds tucked deep in the forest. Far from any known site. Locals sometimes talk about burial circles hidden off-trail. Low round mounds that don't match the more famous native sites in the area. What keeps this legend alive isn't just what was said. It's what still might be out there. The Yucas are remote. Thick with forest. Hard to access in many places. And not as heavily studied as other parts of the state. It's the kind of place where secrets could absolutely stay buried. If there was an isolated group living here once. Building with stone. Hiding in caves. It's possible we haven't found everything they left behind. And maybe we never will. Maybe they were just a small forgotten branch of a known tribe. Maybe they were something else entirely. But either way, the mystery touches something deep. It's not about proving a theory. It's about wondering what's been lost, wondering who walked these trails before us, wondering if the land remembers what people have forgotten. Today, the Awatches draw mostly campers and bird watchers. You can hike for hours without seeing another person. The wind moves through the pines. Creeks run cold through the valleys. Everything feels untouched. But if you know what to look for, stone rows under the moss, faint terraces cut into the hillside, or strange markings inside shallow caves, you might start to wonder, too. You might ask yourself, who lived here before the names and dates? Who built things that don't match the record? And why did they disappear so quietly? Maybe the truth is still out there, hidden beneath the leaves and lichen. Or maybe the mystery itself is what they left behind. A story wrapped in silence meant to keep us looking. And so the lost tribe of the UAS remains just that. Lost but not forgotten. The ghost city of Fryer. Not far from the edge of Lake Pontchartrain. Tucked between the cypress trees and tangled swampland west of New Orleans. There used to be a quiet little town called Fryer. Today, you'd never know it was there. The woods have taken it back. The water covers most of what's left. But if you ask around, maybe talk to an old fisherman or one of the swamp guides, they'll tell you that Fryer didn't just vanish. It was taken. To understand the story, you've got to go back more than 100 years. Back then, Fren wasn't much. Just a small settlement perched along the railroad tracks. It had a post office, a depot, and a few dozen homes built near the edge of the swamp. Most people grew cabbage, worked the rail line, or harvested cypress lumber. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a place where people lived, worked, and raised families. It had its own rhythm. And then came Julia Brown. Julia lived right on the edge of town, where the land melts into marsh. She was known as a healer. Some say she practiced voodoo. Others say she was just deeply spiritual. Either way, people came to her for help. Herbal remedies, prayers, blessings. She wasn't exactly warm, but she had a reputation for being powerful, respected, and feared. Over time, folks started depending on her too much. They came with their problems, asking for help again and again. But they didn't always show gratitude. Some say Julia felt used, like the whole town leaned on her, but didn't really care about her. And according to legend, she grew bitter. Then came the warning. One day, I'm going to die, she supposedly said, and I'm going to take the whole town with me. At first, people brushed it off. Maybe she was angry. Maybe it was just talk. But that one sentence stuck around, and everything that happened next made it hard to forget. Julia Brown died on September 28, 1915. The town planned her funeral for the next day. People gathered. Family, friends, neighbors, all coming to pay their respects. That same day, without much warning, a massive hurricane began forming in the Gulf of Mexico. Overnight, it strengthened into a monster. On the morning of September 29th, just as the funeral was getting underway, the storm slammed into the Louisiana coast. What followed was chaos. Winds over 100 miles per hour ripped through the swamp. The waters of Lake Pontchartrain surged inland. Trees snapped like twigs. Homes were torn apart. The town of Frenier, along with nearby communities like Rudock and Napton, was destroyed. Flattened. Washed away. Hundreds of people died. Entire buildings vanished into the flood. Train tracks were twisted and drowned. Survivors later said the sky went black in the middle of the day. One haunting story claims Julia's coffin was seen floating through the floodwaters, carried on the current like a final curse made real. After the storm, nothing was ever the same. Friend never rebuilt. The train stopped running. The houses were gone. The people who survived moved away, and the land began to sink back into the swamp. The town disappeared from maps, but not from memory. And that's when the story started. People began hearing things. Whispers in the trees. Singing that didn't seem to come from anywhere. Humming low and eerie. Sometimes right before a storm. The same melody over and over. One day I'm going to die and I'm going to take the whole town with me. Nobody can prove Julia ever said that line. But it shows up again and again in the retellings. It's part of local folklore now, embedded in the way people talk about that place. So, what do we actually know? We know Fryer was a real town, a railroad hub for swamp agriculture, particularly cabbage farming and logging. It had homes, community, a way of life, and we know Julia Brown was real, too. Her name appears in census records. Her death was recorded in 1915, and the hurricane, that was no legend. It's known today as the New Orleans Hurricane of 1915, one of the deadliest storms in Louisiana history. Over 275 people died. It leveled entire towns, caused millions in damages, and left behind a path of destruction that stretched for miles. But the coincidence that Julia died just hours before the storm made landfall is what transformed a natural disaster into a ghost story. Some say it's all superstition, that people needed a way to explain such a terrible loss. And Louisiana has always been a place where Catholicism, folklore, and African spiritual traditions blend together. When something tragic happens, it's not unusual for people to look for signs, patterns, or meaning in it. Still, there's something about this story that lingers. The timing, the tone, the way people tell it. Like they're not sure whether they believe it or not. But they don't want to risk calling it a lie. If you try to visit Fanier today, you won't find much. The original site is overgrown and swampy. Parts are underwater. You can get close by airboat or on a guided swamp tour. And some locals might point out bits of the old town. Collapsed pilings, rusted metal, pieces of track slowly sinking into the mud. The area isn't abandoned. Not entirely. There are still fishing camps and scattered homes along the lake. And some residents still use the name Far to describe the region, even if the original town is long gone. But the atmosphere is different, especially when a storm starts to roll in. The wind gets sharper. The trees seem to shift and whisper. And if you're standing near the water, can feel like something is watching. Not malevolent exactly, just present. In recent years, the story of Julia Brown has become popular again. Ghost hunting shows have filmed episodes out there. Paranormal investigators have come looking for her spirit. Some say they've recorded voices or captured unexplained sounds. Others walk away with nothing but a feeling, a sense that something is out there just beyond reach. And maybe that's the power of the legend. It gives shape to what we can't explain. A whole town wiped out seemingly overnight. No warning, no reason. And in the space where answers should be, we find stories. Julia Brown becomes more than a woman. She becomes the embodiment of every ignored warning, every unreturned kindness, every forgotten soul, whether you believe in the curse or not. Freer's story is more than just a ghost tale. It's a reminder of how fragile our towns, our lives, and our histories really are. It shows how quickly nature can erase what we build and how long our voices can echo if they're loud enough when we leave. So next time you're near the swamp and the wind picks up, listen closely. You might just hear a song in the distance, a quiet hum, a story that never quite died. The tuna treasure. In a quiet pocket of Louisiana, tucked near the Mississippi River, lies a town called Street. Francisville. It's peaceful, the kind of place where time moves a little slower. But in the late 1960s, Something happened there that stirred up centuries of history and set off a battle that would change how America handles its past. The story begins in 1968 when a man named Leonard Sherrier was poking around a place called Trudeau Landing. It was an old plantation site. Nothing fancy. Just a stretch of riverbank with soft soil and scattered trees. Purer wasn't an archaeologist or a historian. He was just curious. But what he found buried beneath the earth would shake both of those worlds. He hit what turned out to be ancient burial sites. Graves, really. Inside them were objects that didn't belong to him. Copper pots, iron tools, shell beads, weapons, and all kinds of delicate handcrafted items. These were sacred. Many of them had been placed in graves alongside the remains of tuna ancestors. To the tuna Biloxi people who'd been pushed and scattered across Louisiana over the centuries. These items held deep spiritual meaning. They told stories. They carried memories. And now they were being sold off piece by piece like souvenirs. Back then, the tuna Biloxi tribe was living mostly in central Louisiana with limited resources and even less visibility. But when they found out what was happening at Trudeau Landing, they didn't stay quiet. They decided to fight. And it wasn't just about getting back the artifacts. It was about protecting their history, their identity, and their dead. That's when things got serious. The tribe filed lawsuits going after both the state of Louisiana and the institutions that had bought or taken pieces of the treasure. At the time, there were no strong laws about returning Native American cultural items. The tribe was trying to do something that had rarely been done before. Demand the return of stolen history. This legal fight dragged on for years. Almost 2 decades. But the tuna boilie didn't back down and eventually they won. Not just a little. They got back everything. The items. The human remains. The whole collection, which became known as the tuna treasure, was returned to the tribe. It was one of the biggest repatriations of Native American cultural material in U.S. history. And it helped lay the groundwork for something much bigger. In 1990, partly because of this case, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA for short. It gave tribes legal tools to reclaim sacred objects and ancestral remains from museums and other institutions. The tuna treasure played a major role in making that happen. But let's go back to the treasure itself. Because it's more than a pile of artifacts. It's a snapshot of a world in transition. Inside the collection, you'll find traditional native tools, pottery, and beadwork, but also European items like French knives, Spanish coins, and glass beads that came from across the Atlantic. These weren't random trade goods. They were signs of a people adapting to survive, navigating early colonization, and making choices about what to hold on to and what to let go. What's especially moving about the treasure is the craftsmanship. The detail in the jewelry, the smooth polish of the stone tools, the way even the simplest items carry a sense of intention. These things weren't buried just to fill space. They were meant to go with loved ones into the afterlife. Losing them wasn't just an archaeological loss. It was a theft of spirit. Today, if you visit the Tuna Biloxi Cultural and Educational Resources Center in Marksville, you can see many of these items on display. The center is quiet, not flashy or high-tech, but there's a reverence in the way everything is arranged. Feels like a place for reflection, not just observation. The tribe didn't just get their items back. They turned that victory into a space for learning, healing, and cultural revival. What's even more powerful is knowing that the Tuna Biloxi people are still here, still preserving their traditions, still telling their story in their own voice. For a tribe that was once nearly erased, that's no small thing. But there's something else to consider. Something that still hangs over this story like morning fog on the Mississippi. What else is buried out there? Trudeau Landing was just one part of a larger settlement area. Archaeologists believe there could be other graves, other ceremonial sites, maybe even entire villages hidden beneath farmland or river mud. Some may never be found. Others might already be gone, lost to erosion or bulldozers. The question now is whether Louisiana and America has learned enough from the Tunica treasure to treat what's left with care. Because that's what this story is really about. Not gold or fame or adventure, but memory, how we hold it, how we protect it, and how easily it can be taken away. The Tuna treasure isn't just a collection of old things. It's a bridge between generations, between cultures, between silence and truth. And it's a reminder that sometimes the real treasure isn't what we dig up, but what we choose to honor. The cursed mounds of Marksville. In the quiet town of Marksville, right in the middle of Louisiana, there's a small park that doesn't look like much at first. It's got rolling grass, a few trees here and there, and a walking path that winds between low, rounded hills. Most people driving by probably wouldn't think twice. But those hills aren't just part of the landscape. They're ancient. And for some folks, they're more than just archaeological sites. These are the Marksville Mounds. And for as long as people can remember, they've been rumored to be cursed. Now, the history here is older than you might expect. Around 2,000 years ago, from roughly 100 B.C. to 400 CE, this land was home to a group of people known today as the Marksville culture. They were part of a broader network called the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, a kind of trade and ceremonial alliance stretching across much of the eastern U.S. They built mounds, held ceremonies, and buried their dead with care and intention. The Marksville site was one of their ceremonial centers, and over time, it grew into something sacred. But fast forward to the present, and that sacred feeling hasn't gone away. In fact, for some, it's grown heavier. Strange stories have clung to this land. People claiming to feel uneasy near the mounds. Weird equipment malfunctions. Dreams that don't quite feel like dreams. And for those who've tried to take something from the site, whether out of curiosity or greed, the stories get even darker. That's how the place got its nickname, the Cursed Mounds of Marksville. Let's start with what we know. The site is made up of several mounds arranged in a kind of circular pattern, with the biggest one called Mound 4, rising about 30 feet above the flat Louisiana terrain. There's also a ridge or embankment that might have marked off a ceremonial space. Archaeologists have found pottery, tools, ornaments made from copper and shells, and even remains of wooden buildings that once stood atop the mounds. What really stands out, though, is how carefully everything was planned. These mounds weren't random piles of dirt. They were built with purpose. Underneath the largest mound, they found graves. Some had elaborate offerings, carved pottery, shell jewelry, copper pieces. These weren't everyday folks. These were people who likely held spiritual or social importance. Leaders, shamans, maybe ancestors tied to the rituals of the land. But somewhere along the line, people stopped treating the site with the same respect. In the 20th century, especially during the 1930s and again in the 1960s, amateur relic hunters started poking around. Some were looking for artifacts to sell. Others just wanted a piece of history. Either way, they disturbed the land. And that's when the bad luck stories began to snowball. People who took objects from the mounds started having accidents. One man who pocketed a pottery shard later lost his home in a fire. Another described feeling a crushing pressure on his chest just from standing on one of the mounds. Some who worked there reported unexplained sickness, financial disasters, or just a long stretch of things going wrong. At first, most folks didn't make the connection. But as the stories added up, locals started warning each other. Don't mess with the mounds. Don't take anything. Don't even joke about it. Even professional archaeologists haven't been immune. Some who worked at the site told of failed equipment, corrupted data files, and nights filled with strange, unsettling dreams. Nothing that screams paranormal activity, but just enough to notice, enough to wonder. This kind of thing isn't unique to Marksville either. All across the Mississippi Valley, Ohio, Arkansas, Illinois, you'll find similar stories. Burial mounds that carry warnings. Sites where disruption seems to bring misfortune. Whether it's a spiritual consequence, a psychological reaction, or just coincidence, the pattern is hard to ignore. Part of what feeds the mystery is how little we actually understand about the beliefs of the Marksville people. There's no written language left behind. And the oral traditions, if they ever existed, didn't survive. What we know comes from the layout of the mounds, the placement of burials, and the objects buried with the dead. Some researchers think the entire site was aligned with the stars or the seasons. Maybe it was used for solstice ceremonies. Maybe it marked the changing of the year. But truthfully, we don't know. And in that space of not knowing, stories grow. To the modern-day descendants of tribes in this region, especially those tied to the Marksville, Biloxi, and Tuna peoples, this isn't just a historic site, the sacred ground, not a museum exhibit, not a tourist stop. It's a resting place. And to them, the idea of a curse isn't about vengeance or ghost stories. It's about spiritual imbalance. You disturb the peace of the dead, and things fall out of place. That's not superstition to them. It's a deep part of their worldview. Today, the Marksville Mounds are protected as part of the Marksville State Historic Site. There's a small museum nearby with displays of pottery and maps of what the village might have looked like. A walking trail loops through the area, and on most days it's quiet, peaceful even. But once you step into that space, you feel it. The air changes. There's a certain stillness, like the ground is listening. The sun seems to fall a little differently on the earth here. It's not threatening us to wear. There have been a few efforts over the years to develop the area. Add parking, lay new roads, maybe even build a hotel nearby. But nearly every project ran into problems. Delays, budget issues, local resistance. You can chalk that up to planning failures if you want. But the timing always seems a little too cursed. And that's really the heart of the story. Not the ghost tales or the accidents, but the tension between two ways of looking at this land. On one side, you've got the archaeologists and historians digging, cataloging, trying to understand a vanished culture. On the other, you've got the locals, the descendants, the visitors who sense that this place is still very much alive in its own way. And in the middle sits the earth, silent, old, and holding more than it lets on. So if you find yourself in Marksville and you decide to visit the mounds, don't expect anything flashy. There's no sound and light show, no costumed guides. What you'll get is something much more subtle. The weight of time, a sense of presence, and maybe, just maybe, a whisper of something older watching from the trees. And one more thing. If you happen to pick up a stone or a bit of pottery, even just out of curiosity, don't pocket it. Put it back where you found it just in case. Indian village on Ever Island. When most people hear Every Island, they immediately think of one thing: Tabasco sauce. That familiar red bottle has made the place world famous. And sure, it's a big part of the story, but it's not the whole story. Long before the McIlhenny family started bottling hot peppers, this patch of land was home to a much older, quieter chapter in Louisiana's history. Beneath the fields and factory lies the barely remembered footprint of a Native American village, one that may go back thousands of years. Now, Avery Island isn't an island in the usual sense. It's actually a salt dome, one of 5 in southern Louisiana. These domes rise slightly above the marshes, which might not sound like much, but even a few feet of elevation can make a huge difference in a landscape full of swamps and wetlands. For ancient peoples, that dry, stable land was valuable. But Avery Island offered more than just high ground. It had fresh water, game, wild plants, and most importantly, salt. All the basics for survival in one place. Archaeologists believe that Native Americans lived on or around Avery Island as far back as 2,500 years ago. That's older than many well-known historical landmarks. The earliest people here were likely part of cultures we now call coastal Coles Creek and later on the Playmine culture. These weren't wandering nomads. They built earth mounds, lived in villages, and had complex spiritual practices. And what drew them to island besides the elevation was the salt. Natural saltwater springs bubbled up from beneath the dome. People would collect the brine and let it evaporate in the sun, leaving behind salt crystals they could use for food, medicine, and trade. Over the years, bits and pieces of this ancient world have surfaced. Pottery shards, stone tools, shell ornaments, even human remains. Early on, it seems small groups came just to gather salt or hunt for a season. But over time, the island became more than a stopover. It turned into a settlement. The proof is in the shell mittens. Huge piles of discarded oyster and clam shells. These trash heaps may not sound exciting, but they're a sign that people stayed here for a long time, eating from the sea and living off the land. Some of the pottery styles found around Avery Island match those from other parts of the southeast, showing that this place was connected to bigger trade networks. So, this wasn't just an isolated community. It was part of a larger world, a node in a vast web of tribal relationships, goods, and ideas. And yet we still don't know the name of the people who lived here. We don't know what they called this place or themselves. There are no surviving written records, no ruins above ground, and not enough oral history has survived to draw a straight line from then to now. That silence has made it easy for the ancient village to slip into the background. The spotlight has mostly stayed on the more recent history, the plantations, the salt mines, and of course, the hot sauce factory. In the 1800s, the Avery family began extracting salt from the dome in a much more industrial way. During the Civil War, the salt from Avery Island was so important that Union forces raided it to slow down the Confederate supply chain. After the war, the Melhenny family began planting peppers, and in 1868, they launched the first bottles of Tabasco sauce. The business grew and grew, and the land changed with it. To build the factory, lay pipelines, and farm the peppers, large parts of the island were cleared or reshaped. It's very likely that more than a few ancient artifacts were disturbed or lost in the process. Even today, we don't really know how much history lies just below the surface. How many stories were paved over literally and figuratively. To be fair, the Melhenny family did try to protect parts of the island. In the early 1900s, they opened jungle gardens, a large semi-wild preserve filled with exotic plants, birds, and scenic trails. It's a beautiful place to visit with peacocks, bamboo groves, and snow-white egrets nesting above the water. But even that landscape might be covering parts of the old village. Decorative ponds and imported trees can easily hide the traces of something ancient. If you visit jungle gardens today, you're walking on sacred ground. You just might not realize it. And that's the hard part. There's a quiet tension on Avery Island between what we celebrate and what we forget. On one hand, there's a story of local success and innovation. None the other. It's a place where native history has been almost completely buried. A few museum exhibits and plaques nod to the island's ancient past. But most visitors never hear about the village that came long before Tabasco. Recently, though, that started to change. Some archaeologists and native groups have shown renewed interest in the site. They're using non-invasive tools like ground-penetrating radar to search for what still lies beneath the soil. The hope is to map the settlement without disturbing it further. The challenge, of course, is that Avery Island is still a working business, a tourist attraction, and a family-owned enterprise. Balancing economic use with historical preservation isn't easy. Still, there's real potential here. If more attention is given to the island's native history, there's a chance to recover more than just artifacts. There's a chance to connect the land to living descendants, to bring back a sense of continuity that's been lost. But that takes more than just curiosity. It takes respect. It means making room for stories that haven't been told yet. If you ever find yourself at the edge of Avery Island, looking out over the marsh where the trees start to thin, take a moment. You might hear a bird call in the distance or feel the damp wind moving through the oaks. But there's another kind of silence here, too. Something deeper. It's the silence left behind by people who once lived close to this land, who understood its value, not just in what it could produce, but in how it sustained them spiritually and physically. Their story isn't gone. It's just waiting beneath the gravel paths, the pepper fields, and the manicured gardens, waiting for someone to stop and ask what came before.